The promise I broke was a small one. That's the part that still sits with me, 30 months on. Not the big promises, those I kept or died trying. The small one. I told my daughter I'd fix the loose board on the back porch before Sunday, and Sunday came, and I didn't, and then the world ended on a Tuesday, and the board stayed loose, and I never saw that porch again. You'd think after everything, after the miles and the cold and the people I had to leave in places I won't say out loud, you'd think the porch board would have faded. It hasn't. I think about it most mornings when I'm making coffee in a kitchen 40 feet underground, where there are no porches at all. My name is Hollis Ray Tankersley. People who've known me longer than a phone call me Holly, which is a thing my wife started in 1998 to annoy me, and which stuck the way the best jokes do. I was 43 when it happened. I've been a stationary engineer for 19 of those years, which is a fancy way of saying I kept the guts of large buildings alive. Boilers, chillers, generators, water systems, the patient, unglamorous arteries that nobody thinks about until the lights go out. Before that, I'd done 3 years in the Navy as a machinist mate, which mostly taught me that anything mechanical will fail in the exact way you didn't plan for, at the exact moment you can't fix it. That lesson turned out to be load-bearing. My wife Denise died 18 months before the outbreak. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't argue with you. She was diagnosed on a Thursday in March and gone by the second week of October. And I spent that summer learning that a man can hold a hand for 9 hours straight without realizing he hasn't eaten. After she passed, I moved out of our house in Roanoke and rented a smaller place near the school where my daughter taught because I couldn't sleep in the bedroom anymore and selling felt like a betrayal. So the bedroom stayed, and I left. That's the kind of compromise grief makes you accept. My daughter, Tessa Marie Tankersley, 26, 6th grade science teacher, the spitting image of her mother and twice as stubborn, was a reason I'd taken the job at the Regional Building Services Company 3 years before. The job paid less than the contract work in Northern Virginia, but it put me 35 minutes from her front door, and after her mother died, that distance was the only math I cared about. She lived in a fictional little town I'll call Bracken Hollow, tucked in a fold of the Blue Ridge about an hour south of Roanoke, where the road climbs up past a closed sawmill and a Baptist church with a steeple that lists slightly to the east. The school where she taught was called Bracken Hollow Consolidated, K through 8, 80-some kids, 2 playground swings, and a flagpole that hummed in a north wind. That school is the school in the title. I'll get to it. I had a brother too, Wendell, 2 years younger, an over-the-road trucker out of Knoxville. I had a mother, Loretta, 71, living in a duplex in Christiansburg with her sister Doreen. I want to name them now because you're going to ask about them later, the way I asked about them later, and I want you to know I carried them with me from the first hour. The thing about the outbreak, and I've heard 100 versions told 100 ways since, in shelters and on shortwave, and once by a man with no shoes outside a Tractor Supply in Tennessee. The thing about the outbreak is that it didn't announce itself. It crept in like a draft under a door. You didn't notice the room getting colder until you reached for a blanket. For me, it started on a Tuesday morning in late May with a phone call from my daughter at 7:11 a.m. I remember the time because I just looked at the microwave and thought I was going to be late for a boiler inspection in Salem. She said, "Dad, did you hear about the thing in Norfolk?" I said no. She said, "Some kind of riot at the hospital. They're saying it might be a contagion." I said, "Honey, every hospital riot in the last 10 years has been called a contagion by somebody on the internet by lunchtime." She said, "Yeah, probably." And then she said, "Will you call me later anyway?" That was the first sign. Not Norfolk. The way she asked me to call her later. I drove to Salem. The boiler was fine. The building manager wanted to talk about a chiller rebuild. By the time I got back to my truck at 12:45, my phone had 4 missed calls, and the radio was running an emergency advisory I'd never heard before. Not the test tone, the real one, the slow one that sounds like a doorbell rung underwater. The advisory said a public health event was developing in coastal Virginia and that citizens within 50 miles of Hampton Roads should shelter in place. I was 190 miles inland. I called Tessa. She picked up on the first ring. "They sent the kids home," she said. "Half of them. The other half, the parents didn't come." "Where are you now?" "Still at school. Mrs. Petrie's here. We've got 11 kids without rides." Mrs. Petrie was the principal, a woman in her 60s named Avis, who I'd met twice and who had the patient, unflappable bearing of somebody who had taught fourth grade through 3 wars and a divorce. She was the second reason I trusted my daughter to that school. "Stay there," I said. "I'm coming." That's the decision the whole story hangs on, and I want to be clear that I didn't make it cleverly. I didn't weigh options. I didn't run scenarios. I just heard my daughter's voice and started moving. If I'd been a better planner, I'd have stopped at home first for the bag I kept in the closet, bug-out bag, 3 days of supplies, a folding knife, a water filter, a hand crank radio, a change of socks, the usual. I didn't stop. That was my first mistake. By the time I realized I'd left it, I was already 40 miles down the road, and the traffic on 220 South had started doing the thing traffic does when it's trying to decide whether to panic. I called my mother from the truck. She picked up. "Holly, honey, are you watching this?" "I'm driving to Tessa." "Mom, listen, I want you and Aunt Doreen to throw clothes in a bag. Just clothes, medications, whatever cash you've got. I'm going to swing by on the way back." "On the way back from where?" "From Bracken Hollow. I'm getting Tessa. I'll come for you tonight. Before dark." She was quiet for a second. "Okay, baby. Okay. Should I call your brother?" Yeah, call Wendell. Tell him to come home. Tell him not to argue." I called Wendell myself 10 minutes later and got his voicemail. I left a message. I left 3 more over the next 2 hours. He never called back. I want you to hold that fact lightly. I'll come back to it. The drive to Bracken Hollow normally took 52 minutes from Salem. That day it took 2 hours and 11 minutes. Traffic on 220 was heavy, but moving until Boone's Mill, where a state trooper had the right lane coned off for what looked like a routine accident. A sedan into the guardrail, hazards on. Except as I passed, I saw the driver still inside, slumped against the wheel, and a second trooper standing back from the open passenger door with his hand on his sidearm. He wasn't looking at the driver. He was looking past him, at something in the woods. I didn't see what was in the woods. I saw the trooper's face, and that was enough. The trooper's face was the second sign. I rolled the window up. I turned the radio off. I drove. Bracken Hollow sits in a little valley along a creek called the Pawpaw, which feeds into the Roanoke River about 12 miles east. The town is one stoplight, a feed store, a diner called the Blue Plate, a Methodist church, a Baptist church that disagrees with the Methodist church about almost everything, and the school. The school sits on a low rise on the south edge of town, behind a chain-link fence with a gate that doesn't latch right. The building itself is older than it looks. A 1953 single-story brick rectangle with a 1970s gymnasium addition stuck on the back like a barnacle. I've been inside maybe a dozen times for Tessa's events, and once on a Saturday to fix a leaking flush valve she'd been complaining about. I pulled into the gravel lot at 22 minutes past 2. There were 4 cars there besides Tessa's and the principal's. The flag was at full mast, and the wind was working it. I got out of the truck, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet the town was. No traffic on the road behind me. No mower running. No dog. The cicadas hadn't started yet that year, so there was just air and the flag rope tapping against the metal pole, and somewhere up the ridge, a single crow. The school's front door was propped open with a wooden wedge. I went in. Avis Petrie met me in the hallway with her glasses pushed up on her gray hair and a look on her face that I've seen exactly twice since. Once on a man whose wife had just died, once on a woman who'd just delivered a stillborn baby in a stairwell. It was the look of a person managing a thing she had not yet been allowed to feel. "Mr. Tankersley," she said, "Tessa's in the gym with the children. We've turned on the television in the office. You should see it before you go in." I followed her to the office. The television was an old tube model bolted to a ceiling bracket above the secretary's desk, the kind you'd find in a hospital waiting room in 2003. The picture was a national network feed. A reporter in a parking lot somewhere, I never figured out where, was standing in front of a hospital with the camera trained on the entrance doors. A woman was being walked out by 2 men in scrubs. She was moving wrong. Her head was tilted, her shoulders were forward, and she was walking the way a person walks when they've just woken up and don't know where the bathroom is. One of the men in scrubs was talking to her. She wasn't answering. Then she turned very fast and bit him in the side of the neck. The feed cut. Avis Petrie watched my face the entire time. When the screen went to color bars, she said, That's been replaying every 14 minutes since noon. They aren't going to a studio. There isn't a studio. Okay, I said. I said okay several more times because my mouth needed something to do while my brain was rebooting. Then I said, how many kids do you still have here? 9. 2 were picked up an hour ago. Their parents, both parents, looked like they weren't certain where they were going next. Phones. Cell is intermittent. The landline still works. Okay, I want to take Tessa and as many of those kids as we can find homes for. We'll do the route together. I got a 4-door pickup, 8 seatbelts if we double up the little ones. Anyone we can't deliver, they come with us. Come with you where? I didn't have an answer to that. I said, Christiansburg first. I'm getting my mother and her sister. After that, we'll figure it out. Avis Petrie nodded once. I'll get the children. I want to tell you something about Avis Petrie because she matters. She had been the principal of that school for 19 years. Before that, she had been a 4th-grade teacher in Pulaski for 11. Before that, she had been a Peace Corps volunteer in Cameroon for 2. She wore the same kind of dark cardigan every day regardless of weather. And her husband had died of a heart attack in 1997. And her only son lived in Seattle and called her every Sunday. And she had a habit of touching her wedding ring when she was thinking. She touched it now. Mr. Tankersley, she said, before we do any of that, there's something in this building you need to see. I followed her down the hallway, past the lockers painted bus yellow, past the bulletin board where Tessa had pinned up a unit on the water cycle in her own handwriting. We turned right at the end of the hall and went down 3 steps into the lower section of the building, which I'd never been in. The lower section was where the gymnasium addition met the older structure, and there was a steel door there I'd always assumed went to a custodial closet. Avis took a key off her ring on her belt and unlocked it. She said, I want you to understand that I have never shown this to anyone. Not even Tessa. The man who told me about it made me promise. He died in 2011. She opened the door. It was not a closet. It was a stairwell. Concrete walls, painted institutional green, going down. There was a string pull light at the top. She pulled it. A bare bulb came on, and I could see the stairs descending about 12 feet to a landing where they turned and went down again. What is this? I said. In 1961, Avis said, this school was designated a community fallout shelter under the Federal Civil Defense Program. Most schools of that vintage in this region were. Most of them, the shelter was just the basement with a sign on the door. This one is different. The man who told me, his name was Earl Whitcomb. He was the principal here from 1956 to 1978. He told me that in 1963 the Army Corps of Engineers came out here and built something underneath the gym. It was supposed to be a regional command post in the event of a strike on the Roanoke Valley. They finished it in '64 and they decommissioned it in 1972, but they didn't fill it in. They sealed it and gave Earl the keys. I was still looking down the stairwell. Why are you telling me this now? Because I am 72 years old, Mr. Tankersley, and the children are about to need a man who knows what to do with boilers and pipes and electrical systems. And what is down there is no good to me, but might be good to you. I want to step back here and be honest with you about something. I didn't believe her. Not fully. Not in the moment. I thought she was a kind, exhausted woman telling me something she half remembered from a kind, exhausted man, and that what was down those stairs was going to be a moldy 1960s basement with rusted cans of crackers and a Geiger counter that didn't work. I went down because the world was ending and I didn't have a better idea, not because I trusted her account. But I went down, and what I found down there is the reason I'm telling you this story instead of being one of the ones somebody else tells. The stairs went down 41 steps in 2 switchbacks to a steel blast door. The door was set in a concrete frame and had a wheel handle like a submarine hatch, painted gray with the paint flaking at the edges. Above it, stenciled in faded yellow, with a letter CD and a number I couldn't read. On the wall next to it was a steel placard, also stenciled, that said in dry military English, "Authorized personnel only. Key-operated manual override below." Below the placard was a small hinge panel. Avis lifted it, and inside was a brass keyhole. She handed me the key. Mr. Wickham said it would still turn, she said. But he last opened it in 1994. The key turned. I won't pretend it turned smoothly. It fought me for about 10 seconds, and then it gave, and there was a heavy clunk inside the door that I felt through the soles of my boots more than I heard. I put both hands on the wheel and turned. It moved. It was greased. Somebody at some point, decades ago, had greased the gears, and the grease was old and stiff, but it was still grease. After maybe a full turn and a half, the door let go of its frame with a sigh, and air came out of the space behind it. Cool air. Dry. Faintly metallic. Not the wet, rot smell I'd expected. I want you to understand what I felt in that moment, because it's the closest I came that day to anything like hope. The air was dry. Dry air means a sealed envelope. Sealed envelope means a working ventilation system, or at minimum, a non-failed one. I pushed the door open. The room behind it was a small antechamber, maybe 8 feet by 8, with another door at the far end. There were 2 long-dead fluorescent fixtures overhead, and a hand-crank emergency light mounted on the wall, the kind with the red lens. I cranked it. It worked. The red light filled the antechamber, and I could see, on the far wall, a small painted sign. Welcome to Facility 14D. Keep this door sealed. I went back upstairs. Avis was waiting in the office. I said, I need to bring my daughter down there, and the kids, and anybody else we can fit. Today. She said yes. I said, I have to get my mother first, and the kids' families if they want to come. We have maybe 2 hours of usable daylight. She said yes. I said, Mrs. Petrie, are you coming with us? She looked at her wedding ring. She said, I'm going to stay at the school tonight to keep the door open for anyone who comes. Tomorrow morning, if you're back, I'll come down with you. If you're not back, I'll come down alone. I didn't argue with her. You didn't argue with Avis Petrie. You took your orders and you went. I went into the gym. Tessa was sitting cross-legged on a tumbling mat with 9 children around her, reading aloud from a paperback copy of The Whipping Boy. She looked up and saw me, and her face did the thing daughters' faces do when their fathers show up unexpectedly in a crisis. It relaxed and then immediately tightened again, because relief is a luxury, and she didn't have time for it. Hey, Goose, I said. I'd called her Goose since she was 4. Hey, Dad, we're going to take a trip. Mrs. Petrie's going to help me figure out who goes where. Can you keep reading for a minute? Yeah. She kept reading. I watched her for maybe 20 seconds. I watched the kids listen. There was a little black girl in pink overalls with her thumb in her mouth, and a red-headed boy with a Band-Aid on his elbow, and a pair of brothers in matching dinosaur shirts who were leaning against each other the way exhausted puppies do. I made myself a list in my head of every single one of them, and I told myself I was not leaving this gymnasium without all of them accounted for. I'm telling you that now because by the end of the next 48 hours, 2 of them would be gone, and one of those was on me, and I want you to know I knew their faces. We worked out the route in the office. Of the 9 kids, 4 had families within 10 miles whose phones still worked when Avis called. 2 had families whose phones didn't answer. 2 were from a single mother named Carlene, whose number went to a busy signal that I now think was probably a down switch rather than a busy line. 1 was a boy named Davy whose grandmother was his guardian and whose grandmother answered on the second ring and said in a voice I will hear for the rest of my life, "Don't bring him here. He's safer with you." I asked her why. She said, "Just don't bring him here," and hung up. I packed the truck. 7 kids in the back, doubled up with the seat belts allowed. Tessa in the passenger seat. We drove the 4-mile loop first, dropping off the 4 with reachable families, and at every single house, I made the parents come to the door, and I watched their faces for the wrongness I'd seen on the television. I didn't see it. Not yet. What I saw was scared people, hugging their children, asking me what I knew. I told them the truth. Not enough. I told them to fill bathtubs with water, to pull cash from any ATM still functioning, to lock their doors at sundown and not open them for anyone they didn't know by voice. They nodded the way people nod when you're telling them how to use a parachute that isn't going to deploy. The other 3 kids, Davy and the 2 brothers from the absent mother, stayed in the truck. We turned north toward Christiansburg. I called my mother from 12 miles out. She picked up. She was packed. She had Aunt Doreen with her. They were waiting on the porch. That's the only thing in this whole story that went the way I planned it. My mother was on the porch with 2 suitcases and a Tupperware of cornbread, and she got in the truck with Aunt Doreen and the 3 kids without a word of complaint. And Aunt Doreen looked at Davy and said, "Well, "Hello, sweet pea. My name is Doreen. Do you like cornbread?" And Davy nodded the way a 7-year-old nods when he is too tired to speak. We drove back to Bracken Hollow in the dusk. The roads were emptier than they'd been earlier. I saw one car pulled over with the doors open and nobody in it. I didn't stop. Wendell never answered. I left a fifth message from the parking lot of a gas station outside Shawsville, and I told him about Bracken Hollow Consolidated and the shelter under the gym and the key, and I told him if he heard the message, to come, and to come fast, and I told him I loved him. I would leave 2 more messages over the next 9 days. Every time we had a sliver of signal, the last one from the antenna near the top of the school's flagpole at 3 in the morning during a windstorm in mid-June. He never came. I have to tell you now that I don't know what happened to him. I don't think I ever will. The last confirmed location on his trucking company's dispatch board, which I accessed weeks later through a satellite phone we found in the shelter's communications locker, was a truck stop outside Jackson, Tennessee, on the day before the outbreak. The company itself stopped logging entries 4 days after. I have searched the records that survived. He is not in them. He is not in any of them. I have made my peace with not knowing in the only way you can make peace with not knowing, which is by accepting that the peace is not actually peace, just a low, ongoing hum you learn to live with. We got back to the school at 22 minutes after 8. Avis Petrie was waiting in the front office with the lights off and a flashlight on the desk. She had been crying. I didn't ask about what. She said, 2 more families came. They left their children. They didn't stay. How many more kids? 3. A boy and 2 girls. The oldest is 11. The youngest is 4. So now we had 10 children, my daughter, my mother, my aunt, the principal, and me. 15 people. I did the math in my head. 15 people, an unknown supply, situation underground, indefinite duration. I did not know if Facility 14D was a closet or a city. I had cranked one light and seen one sign. The rest was faith and stencils. We took everyone down. I'm going to slow down here because the descent into that shelter is the moment my life divided into before and after, and I want to do it justice. Avis led the way with her flashlight. Tessa came second with a 4-year-old on her hip. The other kids followed in chain, holding hands the way Avis told them to, 2 by 2. My mother came next, with Aunt Doreen behind her on the rail. I brought up the rear with a duffel bag of clothes and a milk crate of canned food we'd grabbed from the cafeteria. We went through the blast door. The antechamber was as I'd left it. I cranked the emergency light again. Avis opened the inner door. What was behind the inner door was not a basement. It was not a closet. It was a corridor. The corridor went 40 feet to a junction. It was concrete-walled, 6.5 feet high, with conduit running along the ceiling and a faint film of dust on the floor that showed our footprints as we walked. At the junction, the corridor split 3 ways, left, right, and straight ahead. Above each branch was a stenciled sign. Left, birthing. Right, mechanical. Straight, command/comms/galley. I want to tell you about the first time I found the mechanical room, because it's the moment I knew we were going to live. I left Avis with the children at the junction and walked down the right-hand corridor with the emergency light. The corridor went 30 feet and ended in a door. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open. Inside was a room about 30 feet by 20 with a poured concrete floor, and in the center of it was a Cummins-Zonin diesel generator. The kind you see in hospitals. 6-cylinder. I judged it at about 100 kilowatts continuous. There was a control panel with the original manufacturer's plate, dated October 1963. Next to the generator was a fuel tank. And here is the part one almost couldn't believe, a fuel tank that was clearly not the original. The original tank was visible behind it, a smaller cylindrical thing with a drain valve. The newer tank was a horizontal cylindrical unit with a sight glass on the side and a stenciled label that read property of VA ARNG, Regional Continuity Asset. The sight glass showed fuel. I would later learn from the logbook in the command room that Facility 14D had been quietly reprovisioned in 1986, 1998, and 2007 by the Virginia Army National Guard as part of a continuity of government program that nobody in Bracken Hollow had ever been told about. The last provisioning run had added a new fuel tank holding 1,260 gallons of diesel with stabilizer, replaced the air filtration cartridges, restocked the dry food pantry, and updated the radio equipment. Then they had locked the door and walked away. They had not been back. Mr. Whitcomb's key from 1994 was still the working key, because nobody at the National Guard had bothered to change the lock. They had, however, replaced the generator's start battery in 2007 and the second one in 2015. The battery in the generator now was a sealed AGM unit with a manufacturing date of June 2015. I sat down on the concrete floor next to that generator and put my hands on my knees and breathed. Then I went to find Avis and tell her we were going to live. I want to give you the tour now, the way I gave it to the kids the next morning, because the listener deserves to know what the place was. The corridor went straight from the entry junction to the command and galley wing. The command room was a 30 by 40 space with a long steel table, 8 metal chairs, a wall of communications equipment, 2 Sinkers radios, a high-frequency single sideband transceiver, a satellite phone unit in a charging cradle, and an antenna patch panel that fed 3 antennas. One antenna was in the original mast. One was in the flagpole. Yes, the flagpole, the one with the rope that tapped against the metal. And one was a fold-out long wire run through the gym's roof. There was a map of southwestern Virginia on the wall, pre-printed, with grease pencil marks I never identified. There was a Bible on the table. There was a coffee mug with a Virginia Tech logo, dried coffee stained still in the bottom. The galley was attached to the command room through swing door. It was a real galley. Stainless steel, 4-burner propane range, gas oven, walk-in pantry. The pantry was the moment Avis cried. The pantry was lined floor to ceiling with cans and dry stores. I will give you what I counted over the next 3 days. 478 number 10 cans of various dehydrated foods. Beef stew, chicken and rice, vegetable soup, peaches, apples, green beans, carrots, refried beans. 83 pounds of dry rice in sealed Mylar bags. 41 pounds of dry beans. 29 pounds of pasta. 6 5-gallon buckets of hard red wheat. 3 of those buckets were dated 2007 and 1 was dated 2015. Powdered milk, instant coffee, salt, sugar, baking powder, yeast and vacuum packs. 2 cases of multivitamins. A medical locker I'll get to. I ran the math 3 times. For 15 people at 2,200 calories a day, the pantry alone was somewhere between 14 and 17 months, depending on how generous I was with the wheat. The wheat I treated as a strategic reserve. The berthing wing had 6 bunk rooms with 4 bunks each, 24 bunks total. There were 2 bathrooms with composting toilets that vented to a stack I would later trace up through the gym's wall and out a small, unmarked hood on the roof. There was a shower room with 2 stalls and a hot water tank fed from a heat exchanger off the generator's coolant loop, which is the kind of thoughtful 1960s engineering that made me want to write somebody a letter of commendation 60 years too late. There was a water system fed from a well that the original engineers had drilled to 194 feet, with a submersible pump on the generator circuit and a 1,000-gallon poly tank in a small alcove off the mechanical room. The well log was in a file folder in the command room. The water tested clean when I ran it the next morning through the test kit I found in the medical locker. I want you to understand, I am a stationary engineer. The men who built this facility were the people who taught the people who taught me. Walking through it, that first night was like meeting your grandfather and finding out he'd built the house you'd been living in your whole life. I got the generator running at 26 minutes past 10 that night. It started on the 3rd crank, which is what well-maintained Cummins diesels do. The lights came on along the corridors 1 bank at a time as the breakers cycled. The children, who had been sitting in the galley eating saltines from a can and drinking water from paper cups, looked up at the ceiling as the fluorescents flickered to life, and the little black girl in the pink overalls said, "Are we in a spaceship?" And Aunt Doreen said, "Yes, baby, we are in a spaceship." That was the first night. I want to back up and tell you what was happening above us, because I learned about it slowly over the next 30 days, and you should know it the way I learned it, in pieces through the radio, through Avis's careful, calm voice as she translated what she'd heard, through the silences when there was nothing to hear. The outbreak had started as best anyone could reconstruct in a hospital in Norfolk on a Sunday night. 2 days before the Tuesday, I drove to Bracken Hollow. A patient had been brought in from a cargo ship out of West Africa with what the admitting doctor thought was viral encephalitis. The patient had died on Monday morning at 4:15. The patient had reanimated on Monday morning at 6:11 and had bitten a nurse named Yolanda Briggs, whose name I learned from a Red Cross bulletin 3 weeks later. By Tuesday at noon, when I'd been sitting in my truck in Salem listening to the emergency broadcast, the hospital had been overwhelmed and the infection had spread through the surrounding 3 blocks of downtown Norfolk. The Navy base went to lockdown on Tuesday afternoon. The interstates out of Hampton Roads went to gridlock on Tuesday evening. By Wednesday morning, the infection was in Virginia Beach, in Newport News, in Williamsburg. By Wednesday afternoon, it was in Richmond because somebody had driven there. By Thursday, it was in Charlottesville. By Friday, it was in Roanoke. It reached Bracken Hollow on the 8th day. I'll come back to that. We slept that first night in 2 of the bunk rooms. Tessa and I took the kids in one. My mother, Aunt Doreen, and Avis Petrie took the other. I lay awake for most of the night listening to the hum of the ventilation system, which ran at a frequency I have come to associate with the deepest peace I have ever known, and I thought about Wendell and about the porch board and about Denise, and at some point near dawn I fell asleep, and when I woke up Tessa was sitting on the bunk across from me with her knees pulled up to her chest, watching the kids sleep. "Dad," she said very quietly, "where are we, really?" A fallout shelter from 1963. Maintained by the Virginia National Guard. We got lucky. She thought about that. She said, "Did we?" I knew what she meant. She meant, we got lucky compared to whom? She meant, every person who didn't get lucky tonight, what does our luck cost them? She meant, how do I live in a building that exists because someone, 60 years ago, was certain enough that the world might end to put 1,200 gallons of diesel under a schoolhouse? I said, we did, Goose. Tonight we did. Tomorrow we figure out the rest. I went up top the next morning at 6:40 a.m., alone, with a flashlight and a pry bar in my heart and my throat. I want to be clear about why. We had not closed the outer blast door yet. Avis Petrie had insisted on leaving it cracked overnight in case anyone else came. By morning, no one had. I went up to close it and to do a sweep of the school for any supply we might want. First aid kits, books, the kids' backpacks, anything from Tessa's classroom, and to retrieve a few things from my truck. I made my second mistake that morning. I'm going to tell you about it now, because I owe it to the telling. I went out to my truck in the parking lot at 7:02 a.m. The sky was the color of an old nickel, and there was a fog hanging in the low places along the Pawpaw Creek. I'd parked the truck near the front of the building. I unlocked it, grabbed my work jacket and a toolbox from the bed and the tool bag from behind the seat, and I was halfway back to the building when I heard a sound from the far end of the parking lot. A scrape, the kind of sound a shoe makes when it drags. I turned. At the edge of the lot, maybe 70 yards away, there was a figure. A man. He was standing very still next to a parked car. One of the cars from the day before, one of the parents' cars, a blue Honda, and he was facing the building. He wasn't moving. His shoulders were forward. His head was tilted. I want you to understand, I had never seen one. Not in person. I'd seen the woman on the television. That was it. So when I saw him, I did the thing every untrained person does when they encounter something they've only heard about. I stood still and tried to figure out if he was alive. I stood there for what felt like a long time and was probably 8 seconds. He didn't move. I took a step backward toward the building. He moved. Not fast. He just turned his head the way a hawk turns its head when something rustles in the grass below it, and then his whole body followed. And then he started walking. Not running. Walking. Steady, mechanical, oriented toward me. I made it to the door. I locked it from inside. I went down to the shelter, and I closed the blast door, and I sealed it, and I did not go back up top for 6 days. The mistake was not the encounter. The mistake was the truck. I had left a 4-door pickup with half a tank of gas and a working starter in the parking lot of a building I now lived under. That truck was visible from the road. The truck told anybody who came looking, human or otherwise, that there were people here. I should have moved it the night before. I should have driven it around the back of the gym and parked it inside the maintenance bay if the bay door would take it, and if not, then quarter-mile down the access road behind a stand of pines I'd noticed the day before. I didn't. I was tired, and the children were tired, and we had cans of food and a working generator, and I had stopped thinking. By the morning of the 4th day, there were 6 of them in the parking lot. By the morning of the 8th day, there were 40. The truck is how Bracken Hollow found us, and Bracken Hollow is how the rest of them came. The week between the closing of the door and the arrival of the dead at the school was the strangest week of my life, and also one of the most peaceful. We were inside. We were sealed. We had power and water and food. We had a community of 15 people who needed each other, and we had work to do. I set a schedule. The schedule was the bone the week hung on. 5 a.m. wake for me and Avis. Generator check, fuel level, water tank level, ventilation system inspection. 6 a.m. wake for the rest of the adults. Breakfast at 6:30. Oatmeal from the bulk wheat ground in a hand mill we found in the pantry, with powdered milk and a little brown sugar. Children up at 7. School at 8. Tessa and Avis took turns running it, because we had a teacher and a principal and 10 children between the ages of 4 and 11, and the world above us was on fire. And the best thing we could give those kids was the unbroken rhythm of the world they knew. They did math at the long table in the command room. They did reading on bunks. They did art on butcher paper with crayons we'd salvaged from Tessa's classroom on the 3rd day, when I made a careful sortie up the corridor with a flashlight and a pry bar and locked the blast door behind me. They did PE by running laps around the corridor junction while Aunt Doreen counted laps and told them about the time she met Loretta Lynn at a truck stop in Wytheville. The little black girl in the pink overalls was named Junie. Her parents were the ones who had dropped her off and not stayed. She was 5. She slept with her thumb in her mouth and her other hand on the back of a stuffed rabbit she'd named, in defiance of all logic, Carl. She drew Carl every day. Carl in a tree. Carl in a boat. Carl in space. Carl wearing a hat. The red-headed boy with the Band-Aid was named Petey. He was 8. He was the oldest of the 2 brothers in the dinosaur shirts. His little brother, 6, was named Tate. They were Carlene's boys, the mother whose phone had gone to a busy signal. I kept trying to call Carlene on the satellite phone from the command room. The line was dead by the 4th day. Davy, the boy whose grandmother had told me not to bring him home, was 9. He was a quiet child with a careful way of holding a fork. He asked me on the 2nd day if I thought his grandmother was okay. I told him I thought she was a smart, careful woman who had made a smart, careful decision, and that she had wanted him to be exactly where he was. He nodded. He didn't ask again. 3 weeks later, he asked me to teach him how to read a multimeter, and I did, and he learned it in one afternoon. The other 6 children I will name once here, and then carry as I've carried them since. Marisol, 11, the oldest, who took to Tessa like a second sister and helped with the 4-year-old. The 4-year-old, Ren, whose parents had been the second to last to drop off. A boy named Cooper, 7, who was Junie's friend and had been at the school waiting for a grandfather who never came. A girl named B, 10, quiet, watchful. And the 2 children from the 11th hour, the ones Avis took in just before I got back with the truck, a brother and sister named Ridley and June. Ridley was 6 and June was 9. They had been left at the school door by a man who had said only, "Their mother is sick. I don't know if I'm sick." Then he had driven away. 10 children, 5 adults, 1 generator, 1 well, 1 pantry, 1 radio. The radio is where the world came in. Avis Petrie, who had taken a single ham radio class in 1998 because she had once thought she might like a retirement hobby, was the one who first got the high-frequency, single sideband transceiver to talk to anyone. On the 3rd day, in the late afternoon, she made contact with a man named Holloway who was operating from a basement in Boone, North Carolina. Holloway had been a radio operator for the State Highway Patrol before he retired. He'd gone underground on day 1 and started building a list. The list was what he called the still talking, places that responded when he called. There were 31 entries on day 3. By the time we'd been in the shelter 10 days, there were 47. By day 20, there were 61. We were on the list as BH1, 15 souls sealed sufficient. Avis spoke with Holloway every evening at 1900 hours. They exchanged a 5-minute summary of what each had heard, then signed off. I have, somewhere in the file cabinet in the command room, the spiral notebook in which Avis kept her transcripts. The first page begins, May 28th. Holloway, Boone, North Carolina. Reports East Coast outbreak confirmed in 14 states. Federal government relocated to undisclosed bunker. Asks if we have children. I told him yes. He cried. So did I. By day 8, the infected had reached Bracken Hollow proper. I heard them through the gym wall before I saw any of them. The sound of an infected pack moving through a small town is not the sound you expect. It is not screams. It is not roars. It is the dry shuffle of many feet on pavement, punctuated by the occasional bang of one of them walking into something, a parked car, a metal fence, a propane tank, and the occasional shark call when one of them caught a sound and oriented to it. They didn't speak. They didn't moan. They listened. The town below us emptied out over a 48-hour period, and by day 10, when I went up the ladder in the mechanical room to inspect the air intake on the roof, I could see most of the parking lot and the road below, and there were maybe 200 of them distributed in clumps, doing what I would come to think of as their dormant standing, motionless, head slightly tilted, like furniture that had been arranged by someone who didn't know what furniture was for. I learned to move quietly. We all did. The shelter's walls were 18 inches of reinforced concrete, and the blast door was rated for substantial overpressure. The rating plate said it would hold a 5-pound per square inch overpressure wave, which means it would hold against any number of unarmed pedestrians indefinitely. But I had no interest in testing what sound carried through what conduit. We spoke softly. We walked in socks. The children, who had a child's natural genius for adapting to the rules of a strange game, made a game of it. They called it the quiet game, and they kept score. We had our first scare on day 9. I want to tell this carefully because the rhythm of it matters. The first scare was not an attack. It was a near thing. The school had a propane tank for the gas range in the cafeteria, a 500-gallon tank on a pad behind the gym. The shelter's galley had been plumbed into that tank in the 1963 build, with a separate cutoff valve in the mechanical room. The valve was original. I checked it on day 1. It worked. The propane was holding. The pressure gauge read steady. On day 9, in the afternoon, the gauge dropped. Not catastrophically, just 3 pounds. Then 5. Then it stabilized. I knew immediately what had happened. Something above had hit the tank, or to the line to the tank, hard enough to crack a seal. We were losing propane. Not fast. Slow. But losing. I had 2 choices. I could shut the valve and switch the galley to the diesel generator's residual heat for cooking, which we could do, but which would cut into our long-term diesel reserve. Or I could go up top and check the tank. I went up top. This was my 3rd mistake and the one that almost cost us everything. I will tell it the way it happened. I went up alone at 3:12 a.m. on the theory that the infected were quieter at night and that I could see them better than they could hear me if I moved slowly. I went out through the gym's back door. The propane tank was 22 feet from the back door on a concrete pad with a small fence around it. I had a wrench, a flashlight with a red filter, and a roll of plumber's tape. I had no weapon because I had not thought to bring one, because I had not yet adjusted my brain to a world in which I might need one to walk 22 feet. I made it to the tank. The leak was in the regulator, a hairline crack in the housing, caused, I would later discover, by an infected having walked into the fence and fallen against the tank assembly. The regulator was reparable with a replacement I had down below. I shut the valve. I started back toward the door. Halfway back, I heard the scrape. It was the same sound I'd heard on day 2, a shoe dragging on pavement. Only this time it was behind me, between me and the door. I turned my head very slowly, and there was one of them at the corner of the gym, maybe 15 feet away, head tilted, oriented toward me. I want to tell you what I felt. I felt the kind of stillness that isn't calm, but compression, every muscle deciding at once that it would prefer to do nothing rather than the wrong thing. I felt very small. I felt very old. I felt my daughter's name in the back of my throat like a coin. It took a step. It stopped. It tilted its head the other way. I took a step toward the door. It took 2. I made the calculation in my head. 15 feet to the corner of the gym for it, 12 feet to the door for me, and I did the only thing I could do, which was move. I went for the door. It came for me. I made it inside with maybe 2 feet of margin, and I shut the door and I dropped the bar, and the bar was an old steel bar that had been welded across the inside of that door by somebody in 1963 who had imagined this exact moment, and the door held. It thudded against the door once. Twice. Then nothing. I sat on the concrete floor inside the gym with my back against the door, and I held the wrench in both hands like a rosary, and I did not move for 13 minutes. When I went down to the shelter and Tessa saw my face, she said, "What did you do?" And I said, "I made a mistake. I'm okay." She said, "What was the mistake?" And I said, "I went up alone without a weapon in the dark." She said, "Are you going to do it again?" I said, "No, I didn't." After that, we made rules. No sorties above ground without two people. No sorties above ground without a melee weapon. And the gym had wooden bats and metal softball bats and a fire axe in the corridor, and we had a complement of long-handled tools in the mechanical room. No sorties above ground at night, unless the alternative was loss of life-critical systems. No sorties above ground without a check-in plan with someone at the blast door. Avis Petrie wrote the rules out by hand on a piece of poster board and taped it to the inside of the antechamber door. The poster board is still there. By day 12, the pattern of life had settled. I want to tell you what it felt like, because this is the part that matters for sleep, the part that matters for the listener who has come here not to be frightened, but to be held. In the mornings, the children woke up to the smell of bread. We had figured out by day 6 that the wheat in the buckets could be ground in the hand mill and turned into a passable yeast bread in the gas oven, and we baked 2 loaves every morning. The smell of that bread filled the corridors and reached the bunk rooms by 6:30, and the kids came shuffling out in their socks with their hair sticking up, and they sat at the long steel table in the command room and ate bread with apple butter from a number 10 can, and they drank powdered milk reconstituted with cold well water, and they were warm, and they were fed, and they were safe. In the afternoons, there was school, and after school, there was what Aunt Doreen called quiet hour, which was an hour and a half of the children doing whatever they wanted in their bunk rooms or in the command room as long as they did it quietly. Junie drew Carl. Petey and Tate built a city out of empty number 10 cans on the floor of the mechanical room, far enough from the generator that I could keep an eye on them while I did the generator check. Marisol read aloud to Wren from a stack of paperbacks Tessa had brought down from her classroom. Bea taught Cooper how to play chess on a board Avis had drawn on a piece of cardboard with a Sharpie. Ridley and June, the brother and sister, slept. They slept a great deal those first 2 weeks. I think they had not slept much in the days before they came to us. In the evenings, after dinner, after Avis had finished her radio check with Holloway, we sat together in the command room, and one of the adults read aloud. We took turns. I read from a paperback of Lonesome Dove that I had brought down from my truck on the second day. Tessa read from a book of her mother's, a hardcover of Wendell-Berry essays that she had carried out of my house when she moved to Bracken Hollow, and that she had been keeping on her bedside table at school for reasons I had never asked her about. My mother read from a Bible. Aunt Doreen read from a paperback of Irma Bombeck that made the children laugh in places they didn't understand. Avis read from a battered copy of The Hobbit. The children listened with their chins on their hands and their eyes drifting toward the ceiling, and the generator hummed below us, and the ventilation moved the air gently across the room, and outside above us, the world ground its teeth in the dark, and we did not hear it. I want to tell you about the night we watched Wren sleep. It was day 15. Wren had been with us for 2 weeks. She was 4 years old, and her parents were almost certainly dead. She had not asked about them in 5 days. She had attached herself to my mother in the way very small children attach themselves to soft, warm things, and she slept now in my mother's bunk, curled against my mother's side, with her thumb in her mouth and her other hand wrapped around a fold of my mother's nightgown. My mother sat very still so she wouldn't wake her. I came in to say good night, and I saw them, and I sat down in the chair at the foot of the bunk, and I watched. My mother looked at me over Wren's hair, and she smiled the smallest smile I have ever seen her smile, and she didn't speak because Wren was sleeping. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes. The light was a single bulb under a frosted glass cover in the corner of the bunk room, and it was warm yellow, and the room was a small concrete room with 3 other empty bunks and a closet with metal hangers, and outside the room the corridor hummed with the steady note of the air handler, and Wren breathed in and out the way a small child breathes when she is not afraid. My mother said, very softly, "I never thought I'd hold another sleeping child in my life." I said, "I didn't either." She said, "Holly, I want you to know, whatever happens, this part was good. I didn't answer her. I didn't need to. I sat there until Rin turned in her sleep and made a small sound and went still again. And then I went to my own bunk and I lay down next to my daughter, who was already asleep with her hand flung out across the bedspread the way she had slept since she was a baby, and I closed my eyes and I slept the way men sleep when they've spent the day fixing things that needed fixing.